In this section on the muscular system, we're going to talk about how muscles get the energy they need to be able to contract. In order to understand this, though, there's a few things we have to know about muscles and how they contract. First of all, a muscle fiber contraction is all or none. What this means is that when a signal is sent from the brain to that muscle fiber, if contraction begins, that muscle fiber is going to finish that contraction. It's not going to stop halfway through. You can't do this you can't just do a partial contraction. It's all or none. So probably at this point you're saying, well, how's that possible? Every time I contract my muscle, I don't do a full motion every time. I can do all these variable motions. I can do a strong contraction, I can do a weak contraction. So if the muscle fiber contraction is all or none, how do I get all these variations? Well, it is possible to get variations, because the way this works is that each muscle fiber individually is an all or none contraction, but you don't have to contract all of the muscle fibers. So remember, our muscle is made up of all these bundles of fibers, and so your brain or your body is able to stimulate some muscle fibers and not others, stimulate a whole section, stimulate just individual pieces, whatever it needs to do to get the contraction done that it needs, the work done that it needs to get done. If we come back to this slide that we looked at before, where we talked about motor units, we looked at how nerves are associated with different muscle fibers. So remember here how this motor unit here, motor unit 2, was stimulating a number of muscle fibers, and motor unit 1 was stimulating other muscle fibers. But notice how all these muscle fibers here are all part of a larger muscle, whether this be the biceps or whatever it may be. So there's not just one nerve stimulating the whole muscle. We have a number of nerves stimulating different parts of the muscle. So if you want to do a small contraction, this nerve may send an impulse down here, and that's going to only stimulate these muscle fibers, and these muscle fibers aren't stimulated. So we have a small contraction as these muscle fibers work. But if it's you're trying to move a large dumbbell or a large material that's really heavy, you're going to need all of the muscle fibers to be contracting. So now each of the nerves, this one as well, is going to be sending signals to the muscle fibers so that all of the muscle fibers are active at the same time. And that's how this works. So depending on the action, different combinations, as you can see it says here, different combinations of muscle fibers contractions may give differing responses. So depending on the combination, we're going to get different contractions, different strengths, different lengths of time, and things like that. There's also this thing called a graded response, and that's different degrees of skeletal muscle shortening. So all of these things work together in order to get this certain contraction that we're looking for. Graded responses, the way that they are produced, there's two things that become important: the frequency of the muscle stimulation, and then also the number of muscle cells being stimulated. So the number of muscle cells, we've already looked at this just a little bit in this past slide, where we're looking at, you may stimulate just a few muscle fibers, you may stimulate a lot of muscle fibers. That's going to affect this type of contraction. But now what we're going to look at now is the frequency as well. Frequency is also important. Or in other words, this is talking about the stimulation coming from the nervous system. So if we have one single stimulation coming to your muscles, that's going to cause a contraction. But these stimulations, if they keep coming one after another very quickly, that increases the frequency, and that's going to increase the muscle contraction and this graded response. So for example, we have something called a twitch. A twitch occurs when you have a single brief contraction. So your brain is sending a signal down the nerves. It comes to that muscle. It tells that muscle to contract. You have a contraction, goes up and down, you're done. So you just have one single signal that's sent from the nervous system. So twitches aren't common. So our muscles aren't always twitching, because that you can't really get much work done if you have this twitching going on. What we're working up to is something called tetanus, and tetanus is a fused graded response where you have a very smooth muscle contraction. So if we add another signal in here, we're going to start summing the contractions. So notice in this case here, we have this first twitch that happens, but before that twitch ends, here we have another stimulus coming in, another signal from the nervous system that says to contract again. So there's just a tiny bit of rest happening here, but it doesn't go back clear to relaxation state. Before we can reach that, we have a second signal coming. But notice here that when we add the second contraction to the first contraction, it is now much larger. We've summed these, we'd added them up, and so now the muscle contraction is much bigger than that initial contraction was. So the more signals that we add, the larger the contraction is going to be, and the less time we're going to have for relaxation in the muscles. So we can add even more signals. This is called unfused or incomplete tetanus. So this is a number of contractions happening one after another. So these arrows here are our signals from our nervous system. Notice how they're summing up. So we have this very large contraction, a lot of strength here, but there's very short relaxation periods in between. So we're not yet a very smooth contraction. There's some little dips in here, but notice how it's all adding together. This finally brings us to complete tetanus. So this graded response here, the signals are coming so quickly and so close between them from the nervous system that there's no chance for the muscle to relax. And so all these are summed together. You have the very strong muscle contraction. Notice there's no dips here, there's no relaxation until the signals finally end. This is a sustained muscle contraction. This is a very smooth, very powerful muscle contraction. We call this tetanus. We don't want to confuse this with the disease tetanus, a bacterial disease where your joints freeze up. This is the same word, but this is talking about muscle contractions and graded responses. And that is how we increase the strength of a stimuli, of a muscle contraction, as we increase the frequency of those signals coming from the nervous system. And then also the muscle force is going to depend on the number of fibers that are contracting at one time. How many of those fibers have been stimulated? The more fibers that are stimulated, the stronger that contraction. And so your muscles can continue to contract until they run out of energy. So when we're talking about energy, when we're talking about muscles, energy is very important. Muscles use a lot of energy. And so let's switch gears just a little bit now and talk about how muscles get their energy, or what types of energy they use. In the previous section, when we were talking about ATP is fundamentally what gives the energy that allows for movement, that allows for action, and specifically in this case allows for muscle contraction. So what's happening when we're eating food, we think of food as being energy, but what happens inside our body is we eat that food, and that food gets broken down to more simple molecules, organic molecules, carbohydrates, specifically glucose, that is able to be burned, and some other organic molecules as well. Proteins can be used to produce energy. Fats, of course, can be used to produce energy. But what's happening is that our body is breaking these down to these smaller molecules, and then when they enter the cell, those molecules are being used to produce ATP. And then it's ATP that releases the energy that allows for things to happen. So ATP is a molecule, an organic molecule. It is a nucleotide. If you remember back to types of organic molecules, we have proteins, we have lipids, we have carbohydrates, and we have nucleic acids. The building blocks of nucleic acids are nucleotides. Nucleic acids are DNA, RNA. ATP is a nucleotide. It's not used to build to build DNA, it's used for energy. And what it stands for is adenosine triphosphate. That's where the name ATP comes from. So the A, the T, and the P. But what this means is this is a molecule that has 3 phosphate groups. I've drawn here a little rendition of an ATP molecule, and you can see on this side of the molecule here I've drawn 3 phosphate groups. So a normal nucleotide is just going to have 1 phosphate group. ATP has 3, and it's in this bond right here, this third ATP, this third phosphate bond, that is where the energy is, I guess you can think of it as being stored. This is where it is, right in that bond. So an ATP molecule with 3 phosphate groups is energized. And what happens is in order to release this energy in this molecule, that phosphate group is going to come off, and you're going to end up with a 2-phosphate molecule called adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2, plus an inorganic phosphate group. So ATP breaks down to ADP plus phosphate, and then as our body breaks down sugars, we're able to rebuild this ATP so that we continually have energy. And this ATP is what is used to cause our muscles to contract. But notice here, though, an interesting thing, that our body doesn't really have a lot of ATP. You don't store ATP. So at any one time, we have enough ATP to last about 4 to 6 seconds. That's not very long. If we don't have any ATP, our body would just shut down. ATP is used for everything, and we only have 4 to 6 seconds worth. So what this means is that our body is constantly recreating this ATP. So, as you start a muscle contraction, your muscles are going to use ATP that it has left over or stored. Again, it doesn't really store it, but the ATP that has left over. Then after that, it has to start making more ATP in some different pathways. So there's some different ways that it does it. First thing you can do is you can phosphorylate ADP. Notice here this is ADP, the adenosine diphosphate, the 2 phosphate groups. And so what phosphorylation means is to add a phosphate group to this ADP. So there's a molecule called creatine phosphate. So creatine phosphate has a phosphate group, and it's kind of a storage molecule for phosphate. So as you use up the ATP stores in your body, in your muscles, as this contraction happens, you're going to end up with this ADP. And so you can take this creatine phosphate molecule, and it can donate a phosphate group to ADP, and then that's going to create ATP. So that phosphate group is coming off here, and then you're going to have just creatine, and you're going to have ATP. So this is the second way that our muscles can quickly get a boost of ATP. But notice here that we have about enough creatine phosphate to last us less than 15 seconds. So we still haven't been able to do much work, and already after 15-20 seconds all of our energy stores are used up. So then at that point we have to move on and and create ATP some other way. This is where aerobic respiration comes in. If you think about the word aerobic, aerobic means with oxygen. So the oxygen that we're taking into our body as we breathe, the reason we're taking in that oxygen is in order to burn food. And so as we take in the food we eat, we take in glucose, it goes through a process where we use oxygen to break down that food and release energy, and that allows us to build ATP. And this does require oxygen, but is able to produce a lot of ATP. So, as we use up our ATP, and then we use up the creatine phosphate stores, then our muscles are going to have to actively start producing ATP. This all happens in the mitochondria. If you remember back to the parts of the cell, we said the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, because it's what produces ATP from the breakdown of glucose. And so the mitochondria is going to start taking that oxygen, burning the glucose, and producing ATP. As long as we have enough oxygen, this can continue and produce a bunch of ATP. In this slide here, you can see where the different kinds of molecules that can be used to produce this ATP. So glucose, of course, sugar, the carbohydrates, that is the molecule of choice in producing ATP. And it goes through this process where it breaks down into what's called pyruvic acid, which then goes into the mitochondria, and eventually we get this ATP. We also get some up here. Here, notice that if it goes into mitochondria, we need oxygen in order to produce ATP. We can get some ATP when we're not using oxygen. We'll talk about that in just a minute. This is called anaerobic. Sorry, let me fix that. This is called anaerobic respiration. An meaning no oxygen present. We can also use fatty acids, so we can burn fats. We can also burn proteins. All of these things can come into the mitochondria, and we use them to produce ATP. We also get out some waste products, and our waste products are, first of all, CO2, and that CO2 we have to breathe out. We have to get rid of that. It's toxic. And then we also have H2O, which is a waste product of this process, but of course can be used inside our body. Down below here we have a list of different molecules that can be used. Notice that amino acids from proteins can also be used to burn. So, for example, if you go on one of those high protein, low carbohydrate diets, you're going to be mainly burning proteins in order to produce your ATP. And we're able to produce a good amount of ATP in this manner. Our muscles can continue contracting for a long period of time. If we keep working out, however, you're going to first of all, start breathing faster, and then pretty soon you're not going to be able to get oxygen as quickly as you're using it up. That's when your body's going to switch over to what's called anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration, again, means without oxygen. And this happens inside our muscles. And the benefit here is that we're not getting enough oxygen, so either our body has to shut down, or we can go into anaerobic. So this allows us to continue working beyond what we normally would be able to using aerobic respiration. However, there are some drawbacks here. First of all, we end up with some waste products, the first one being lactic acid. So if we go back to this previous slide, we are now going to be focusing on this area here without the presence of oxygen. So we're still burning glucose and we're producing a little bit of ATP, but we're not using oxygen. And what happens is the pyruvic acid, which is formed by the breakdown of glucose, pyruvic acid is then converted to lactic acid. And you've probably heard of lactic acid. If you've done any sports, you've been in any sports in school, or if you had any sort of coach or trainer or anything like that, they've talked about lactic acid. And we always associate lactic acid with muscle fatigue, the burning or the soreness of muscles the next day. If you have lactic acid buildup, that means that your muscles were doing anaerobic respiration or anaerobic glycolysis. And that's a good way to train. But this is a toxic substance and your body has to get rid of it. The other thing about anaerobic respiration is that it's good because you don't need oxygen, but it only produces a little bit of ATP. So you can't work out in anaerobic using anaerobic respiration for long periods of time, but it does allow you to go beyond what you could with aerobic respiration. So it's not as efficient. You're not producing as much ATP, but it's faster. You don't have to go through the whole long process of producing ATP. But the drawback here is you do get muscle fatigue. So this lactic acid some way works in causing the muscle fatigue. Scientists aren't really sure how it causes muscle fatigue, but it is associated with it in some way. And so what happens is after you produce all this lactic acid, once you stop working out, then you have what's called oxygen debt, because you've produced all this byproduct, this lactic acid. Now your body has to get rid of that. And so lactic acid there's a few things that can be done. It can be taken to the liver, and it can be reconverted into pyruvic acid or into glucose, and then in the presence of oxygen, it can go back through using aerobic respiration. And another thing recently that scientists discovered is that some athletes can train themselves to actually burn lactic acid as well. But anyway, you do have to get rid of this lactic acid. Notice here at the bottom of this slide it mentions that this is not a long-term source of energy. Very fast, very quick, but not a long-term source of the energy, the ATP needed for muscle contraction. So last of all, in this section, let me just mention a couple types of contraction, a couple terms to know here. We have what's called isotonic contraction, and we have isometric contractions. Isotonic contractions, this is what we're most familiar with. This is what we think of when we think of muscle contraction. So an isotonic contraction means that your muscles are doing what they're supposed to. They contract, the myofilaments, they slide past each other, you have a shortening of the muscle, and you have some sort of movement. So an isotonic, so if you're working out, you're lifting a dumbbell, for example, that's an isotonic. As long as you're able to lift that dumbbell up, that's an isotonic contraction. We also have what's called isometric contractions. And this is when your muscles try to contract, there's a lot of tension, but there's no contraction happening. Okay, so this would be like going up to a wall and pushing against the wall, assuming that you can't push that wall over. So when you push against that wall, it's not moving, and your muscles are not able to contract, but you still have a lot of tension. So you're pushing against that wall, but nothing's happening. Both of these can be useful in exercising. So this is what we call resistance exercises. So resistance exercises increase muscle strength and the size of your muscles. So when you're lifting weights, for example, again, going back to this idea, maybe you're doing some bench presses or something like that. As you're bench pressing, for the first few reps, you're able to do the isotonic contraction. You're able to fully push that bar up, but then eventually you're going to get to a point where your muscles are starting to fatigue. You can no longer do the complete rep, but you're still pushing against that as hard as you can. You're still doing some resistance exercises there, and so you're actually building muscle size and strength by doing that. Also, as we use our muscles, we're going to increase the size of our muscles. We're going to increase our endurance as well. There's a lot of things that are going to come into it. So because our body wants to do aerobic respiration, the more that you work out, the more lung capacity you're going to have. You're going to be able to take in more oxygen, be able to continue aerobic respiration for a longer amount of time. And you're just going to be healthier as well. And then another interesting thing about muscle growth and muscle contractions is that you can continue to build your muscles throughout your life. So at one time they thought that once you were getting older, there wasn't really any benefit. Your muscles are going to shrink and there's no use really working them out. But now they really encourage older people to be active and be lifting weights and working out, because it's going to strengthen your muscles. You're still, even when you're older, able to strengthen those muscles. And it has a lot of other benefits to the body as well, including keeping your muscle mass as well, because your bone mass as well, because your muscles have to attach to your bones, and as you grow your muscles, your bones are also going to increase in size as well. And that is a little bit about the muscle contractions and the energy needed for muscles.